Welcome everyone to Tuleyome's July Nature and You lecture. My name is Geoff Benn. I am the Education Associate at Tuleyome, and I am also your speaker for tonight. We are going to start off with a short introduction of Tuleyome and myself, and then we will jump into our lecture on oaks. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in advocacy and active stewardship with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in the region. The region that we focus on is the northern inner coast range and the neighboring areas of the Central Valley. The northern inner coast range are the mountains that are on the west side of the Central Valley. So they're what you see if you look west from Sacramento or Davis. We particularly focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, which we helped lead the effort to get established, and then very recently helped lead the coalition that got the monument expanded. In addition to our advocacy work, we also do a variety of education programming, including doing a certified California naturalist course every year, nature field trips for K-12 classes, natural history articles in our newsletter, and of course, this monthly lecture series. We also do a variety of adventures programs, including hikes and trail building days for the public, wildflower tours, and we also have a youth boot bank, which provides free loans of hiking boots for kids in our community. If you'd like to learn more about any of Tulyeome's projects, you can do that at our website, tuleyome.org. Okay, so on to tonight's lecture. This lecture series is supported by donations from folks like you. If you haven't already done so this month, we greatly appreciate a donation to help support the program. I've got the QR code on the screen, as along with some of our upcoming events. A little bit about myself. I'm Geoff Benn. I work for Tuleyome. I earned my PhD from UC Davis in plant biology and taught biology at UC Davis and American River College for about 10 years before moving over to my current position at Tuleyome about a year ago now. I'm also a certified California naturalist. All right, so let's move on to our lecture. If you have any questions during the lecture, let's hang on to those until the end, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. All right, so the lecture is all about California oaks, their origins and adaptations. I've always really loved oak trees, but when I moved out to California about 15 years ago, I was just really blown away by the oaks here. Their diversity in form, their beauty, and their ability to grow in environments that are really pretty challenging at times. Here's what I've got planned for us tonight. I'll start off with some acknowledgments. I'll introduce oaks generally and California oaks more specifically. Then we'll talk about how California oaks evolved. And then we'll talk about how oaks deal with some of the major stresses that are present here in California. So drought, fire, sudden oak death. Then I'll conclude with a few thoughts about what the future might hold for our oaks. All right, so to start off, I'd like to preface the talk by saying, I'm not an oak researcher. My PhD was in stress responses in a plant called Arabidopsis. I'm going to be pulling from a few different sources. The first part of the talk about evolution of oaks is based on research that was done led by these three individuals on the slide here, Paul Manos, Andrew Hipp, and Janine Cavender Bears. And I also pulled information from the U.S. Forest Service's Fire Effects Information System, the California Oak Mortality Task Force, and then this classic book, Oaks of California, by Bruce Pavlik et al. There we go. Okay, so what defines oaks? So oaks are trees and shrubs in the genus Quercus. They have relatively small female flowers that are located in the axils of the newer branches. And then male flowers are along these clusters that are called catkins. Now, when we think about flowers, do we notice any kind of common flower structure that's missing from these oak flowers? Why don't you type it in the chat if anything stands out to you? Oh man, Barbara says no petals. That's exactly right. So oaks are wind pollinated, and because of that, they don't need to have showy petals to attract insect pollinators. Another key feature of oaks is that they have a characteristic fruit, which is the acorn. And so the acorn is a fruit, which means it contains a seed. And so I've got a time lapse here of an oak seed germinating. So we can see the fruit splitting open to reveal the seed inside. If you use a razor blade to cut open an acorn, you'll find a seed that has two halves, just like a bean or a peanut. See the embryonic root starting to grow down into the soil here. That senses gravity and is moving down towards gravity. Our embryonic shoot is moving away from gravity up towards the surface. And here's our little baby oak. All right. So there are about 435 species of oaks worldwide. The majority of this diversity is in North America. The region with the highest oak diversity in North America is actually Mexico, followed by California. And so in California, we've got about 21 or 22 different species of native oaks, including tree forms and shrub forms. Note that this is not including subspecies, varieties, and hybrids. If all those things get included, we've got over 40 different varieties of oak in California. So our native oaks are split into three main evolutionary groupings. We have our white oaks, our red oaks, and the golden cup oaks. The white and red oaks take their name from the color of the heartwood inside of the tree, and golden cup oaks, which are sometimes also called intermediate oaks, get their name from the kind of golden hairs that are sometimes, but not always, found underneath the cups of the acorns. There are a number of things in California that have oak in the name, but are not actually true California native oaks. There are tan oaks. They are not in the genus Quercus, so they are closely related. Poison oak is not a close relative of oaks at all. It just has kind of oak-shaped leaves, so that's where that name came from. And then we have a number of different non-native oaks that have been brought in and planted, mostly in urban settings in California. One of those is the cork oak. So if you spent time on the UC Davis campus, there are lots of cork oaks there. Those are from Europe. Okay, so now I'm going to do kind of a quick overview of the kind of major, widely distributed native oak species that are present here in Northern California. And then we'll talk about where they all came from. So first up are the tree species of the white oaks. And so the real monarch of California oaks is the valley oak. This is our largest oak, and it's actually the largest oak species in the United States. And so, as the name might suggest, it is generally found in lowland areas, in valleys, typically pretty close to water sources, and they have really deeply lobed leaves with rounded points. The blue oak might be the most numerous oak in Northern California. So this is found on many of the dry hillsides and ridges along both sides of the Central Valley. Has a smaller leaf that's kind of modestly lobed with a really distinctive blue-green color to it. The Oregon oak leaf looks fairly similar to a valley oak, but the lobes are not as deep. They don't go all the way down to the mid-vein. We also have some shrub species of white oaks in Northern California. So a shrub is when instead of having one single primary trunk, you've got multiple trunks all coming out from the same point. And these tend to not get very tall. So we have our leather oak and our scrub oak. So leather oak is going to be common on serpentine soils. And scrub oak, you're going to see in non-serpentine chaparral environments. Okay, on to our red oaks. We've got three tree forms here. So we have the black oak, which might be one of the prettiest of our Northern California oaks. And so this is one of the few oaks we have here that actually turns a pretty color in the fall. Pretty deeply lobed leaves, but these come to a fine point and often have a little tuft at the end of each point. Two live oaks in this group. So we have our interior live oak and coast live oak. So if you're joining us from the Bay Area, you'll be familiar with these coast live oaks. They're quite numerous along the coast and in the coastal mountains. They both have evergreen leaves, so they're going to stay on the tree year round, really shiny and glossy and quite a bit more rigid than some of these non-evergreen leaves. Way to tell these two apart, mostly location. They tend to not overlap a whole lot. But if you're not sure, you can look for whether or not the leaves are cupped. So coast live oak leaves are generally cupped or convex, whereas the interior live oak leaves are generally flat. Okay, last up we have our golden cup oaks. And so we have another live oak here, so another evergreen canyon live oak. These do overlap with the interior live oaks quite a bit. And so a way to tell them apart is that the canyon live oak will have little kind of golden hairs on the bottoms of the leaves. And then our huckleberry oak, this will be familiar to folks that have gone hiking up in the Sierras. This is a scrub oak that's found in the Sierra. Okay, so pretty clear that we've got a pretty wide diversity of oaks here in Northern California. So let's think about where they came from, how they evolved. So question for you all. So I've talked about the valley oak. Here it is, very pretty. It's only found in California. And so which of these two species do you think our valley oak is more closely related to? Is it closer to the eastern white oak, or is it closer to the California coastal live oak? Go ahead and put your best guess in the chat. All right, so I'm seeing quite a few votes for the white oak, and that would be correct. So that's a little bit surprising, right? That this valley oak is actually more closely related to an oak that really doesn't get west of the Mississippi than it is to the coast live oak, which can be in quite close proximity to. So how did that happen? And so to really understand evolution, we need to use a tool called phylogeny or phylogenetics. And so the group of scientists I introduced at the start of the talk took this approach about 7 or 8 years ago now to build a phylogenetic tree of all of the, or most of the North American oak species. So the way this works is they went out and collected tissue samples from 146 different species from the United States and Mexico. They extracted DNA from those tissue samples, sequenced that DNA, and then fed all of those sequences into an algorithm, which then determined which sequences were most closely related to each other, and then used that to build out this big family tree of North American oaks. And so when we do that, what we see is that our three groups of California oaks are not each other's closest relatives. And so our California white oaks are going to nest within this bigger group of North American white oaks. And then the same is true for our golden cup and red oaks. All right. So the researchers were able to use this phylogeny to start to understand how oaks diversified and moved around the North American continent. And so based on their analysis, what they were able to conclude was that these three groups of North American oaks, the red, white, and golden cup oaks, originated far north in far northern Canada, something like 40 million years ago. They then began to move south, likely as the climate got colder. And then when they hit the Rocky Mountains, representatives of each group kind of split off. Some went west into California and Oregon, and then others went east into the eastern United States. So these two groups are now isolated from each other. And then quite recently, trees from the eastern United States moved down into Mexico and underwent pretty rapid diversification there. All right, so that is how the oaks got to California. And the question is, how do we end up with so many different species here in California? And so the most likely scenario is that we probably had one founder species from each group. So one type of red oak, one type of golden cup oak, and one type of white oak all arrived in California. But then they've subsequently split into all of these different species. And these are just the Northern California species. There's lots of others from Southern California. And so the first good hypothesis to consider when you're thinking about speciation events is geographic separation. This is kind of the classic mechanism that results in one species splitting into two. So for example, let's say you have a river that forms, and now the species are no longer able to interact and reproduce with each other. And because of that, they eventually become reproductively isolated and become separate species. And so let's see if that is a possible option for our California oaks. And so to test this hypothesis, we can look at our distribution of where all these species are found in the state and see whether or not they're geographically separated from each other. And so looking at our tree species of white oaks, what we see is that the distribution is really pretty significantly overlapping. The valley oaks have some unique range in the middle of the valley, but there's lots of overlap in both the Sierra and the coast ranges across all three of these species. So they're definitely not geographically separated. Same is true of our white oak shrub species, lots and lots of overlap all along the coast range, so they're definitely not separated. Same thing with the red oaks. The coast live oaks don't get over into the Sierra, but they have lots of overlap with the other species in the coast range. And so these are definitely not separated from each other either. And then you see the same thing with our golden cup oaks. Okay, so it's definitely not geographic separation that's driving this diversification. So then what is? And so, based on the analysis, the authors found that it's actually stress response strategies, and specifically drought response strategies, that seem to have resulted in this great diversification of all of our California oaks. And so, let's talk about that. And so, first up, let's talk about why plants and humans need water. And so water is required for normal cellular structure and function. And so if you've ever killed a houseplant by not watering it enough, I know I certainly have, you'll know that they eventually wilt. So if you don't have enough water inside of the cells of your leaves, then those cells are going to shrink down and the structure is going to collapse. So that's wilting. Water is also important for plants for transporting minerals from the soil. And so that's where all the nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus and other important minerals are found. And they need to be brought up to the leaves up in the canopy. And so the way that works is through a process called transpiration. And so leaves have little holes in them called stomata that the plant can open and close. And so in the morning, when the plant wants to start doing photosynthesis, it's going to open up the stomata. Water will begin evaporating out of the stomata. And that evaporation is going to pull more water from the soil up through the trunk of the tree. Now, the trick here is that the evaporative force that's required to get water out of the soil is going to increase as the soil dries out. And eventually, you're going to get to a point where it takes so much force to pull that water out of the soil that you're actually going to start pulling water out of the cells in the leaves, and that's going to lead to wilting. Where that point is varies species to species, including within across different oak species. Okay, so California is a pretty tough place to be a perennial plant, especially when it comes to accessing water. And so we have a classic Mediterranean climate here. That means that we have relatively warm, wet winters followed by long, hot, dry summers. And so many of our wildflowers are annuals. So they're going to do their whole life cycle during that wet season, produce seeds, and then those seeds can just sit in the ground during the hot summer, and they can restart their life cycle when the rains return. If you're a perennial plant, like an oak, you don't have that option. You need to find some kind of a way to get through that long, hot, dry summer. And our oaks have adopted a few different strategies for managing that. And so the first strategy is basically just to avoid the problem altogether. So this is what our valley oak does. Basically, it will only grow in areas where it has reliable access to water year round. So it's going to be growing down in those valley bottoms close to rivers or other bodies of water. It'll have a deep taproot to make sure it has water year round. These are also fall deciduous, which means they are going to lose their leaves in the fall and then regrow them in the winter. So this kind of a lifestyle is what we see in most oaks, outside of California. It's probably the ancestral lifestyle for oaks. And so this fall deciduous piece is maybe not super advantageous here. It makes sense in places where it's cold and snowy and leaves could be damaged by frost or by the weight of snow. But here in most parts of the state, we don't have hard frosts or heavy snowfall. And so these fall deciduous plants are actually missing out on a pretty good time of year to grow and access water, which is the winter time. So this brings us to our second strategy for dealing with drought. I call this the drought evasion strategy. This is what the live oaks do. So live oaks have evergreen leaves that are going to stay on the plant for multiple years. And this is going to allow them to do photosynthesis and do most of their growth in the winter and early spring when water is plentiful. And then if things get too hot and dry during the summer, they can basically, go into hibernation, reduce their metabolic activity, um, and then just wait out that hot period. So they're still able to get some growth over the winter. And then it's not so much of a problem if they need to keep those stomata closed during the hottest months of the summer. Their evergreen leaves are also pretty tough and waxy, which does help them to resist water loss as well as damage from wilting. Our third strategy is to tolerate drought. And so the blue oak is the best exemplar of this. They invest heavily in root growth right from germination. So they'll have proportionally pretty significantly larger roots than the above ground shoot section to make sure they're really getting down into the soil to access whatever water is available. They have a thick waxy coating on their leaves. This is why they appear kind of bluish. That's actually from the wax that's on the outside of the leaves. They have a high water use efficiency, so they're able to really maximize sugar production per unit of water that they're evaporating off. And then if it's a really bad year, they're also drought deciduous. So that means that they'll sometimes drop their leaves during the summer and then regrow them the following spring. And then our last group are the shrub oaks, and these kind of pull from several of these different drought tolerance strategies. And so, as I mentioned before, these are going to be short in stature with multiple stems. They have the live oak style leaves that are really waxy and thick. They have a really deep taproot. And some of the species are actually drought deciduous as well. And so the same strategies have evolved independently multiple times in each of our groups of oaks. And so we've got our drought tolerance strategies in the black oak, blue oak, and Oregon oaks. We see the live oak or evader strategy evolving a couple of times in the red oaks and then in the golden cup oaks. And then we see multiple shrub species evolving in each of these three groups. And so what this means is that the reason we have so many different oaks here in California is that that ancestral oak moved into the state, one from each of those groups. And then as they expanded into different parts of the state, they developed new adaptations to fill these different ecological niches where we had different amounts of water available. And so in the white oaks, for example, we see blue oaks and Oregon oaks evolving to really specialize in some of these dry hillsides and grasslands. Our leather oaks specialize in these really hot, dry serpentine environments. And then the scrub oaks are in similar environments, but not on serpentine soils. And the same process repeated itself in the red oaks and the golden cup oaks as well. And so the really cool consequence of this is that as you're out on the landscape, you can actually see all of these different oak species as you pass through these different ecological niches. So this is a Google Earth view of the eastern side of the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, looking west towards the Frog Pond Trail. So we've got Highway 16 running along here, and this is the Cache Creek Wilderness. And so as you start your hike on the Frog Pond Trail, you might see some valley oaks down at the start of the trail near Fisk Creek or Cache Creek. Then as you head up the hot, dry hillsides, you're going to see some blue oaks. There's even a few black oaks hidden away in some of these shadier canyons. And then as you get to some of these really hot south-facing slopes, that's where you're going to find your scrub oaks. And then on some of the patches of serpentine, you might even see some leather oaks. And so, it's just a 5-mile hike, and you can see 4 or 5 different species of oaks, which is pretty cool. And that's all because they've specialized on these different niches across the landscape. All right, so that is oaks and drought. And so next up, I'll talk a little bit about how oaks deal with a few other pretty prominent stresses here in California, starting with fire. And so, as all of you are aware, I'm sure, we're now well into wildfire season. Fire is a natural part of California oak ecosystems, both naturally occurring fire as well as cultural fire. So our California Indian tribes for thousands of years have practiced cultural burning, especially in our oak forest and woodland landscapes to help tend those trees and ecosystems. And so our oaks have really evolved over a really long time to live with and deal with fire. And so oaks are relatively fire tolerant for the most part. So if it's a quick moving grass fire, the tree might be a little bit scorched, but it's probably really not going to have any significant issues. If the fire is more intense and damages or destroys the above ground portion of the oak, there are a couple of different strategies that it can use to regenerate pretty quickly. Because oaks are pretty tolerant to fire, fire actually helps prevent encroachment on oaks by other species, particularly conifers. And so, like all plants, there's kind of 2 strategies oaks have for coming back after a fire. They can either sprout from seeds that have been left in the ground from previous seasons, acorns, or they can resprout from part of the existing tree, such as the root crown. And so we'll talk about the seeds first. Uh, Oaks rely on caching behavior by animals, especially things like squirrels. So squirrels pretty famously collect and bury huge amounts of seeds and acorns, and then they may not be able to return to collect those seeds later. So for example, if it gets eaten by a hawk, say. And so if that seed is buried more than a few inches under the surface of the soil, that's going to provide enough insulation to protect that seed from the heat of the fire. And the seed could then germinate and produce a successor generation of oaks for the ones that got burned in the fire. The advantage of this is that seeds are produced through sexual reproduction, so 2 different parents coming together to make that offspring. So you have better genetic diversity. The disadvantage, though, for oaks is that acorns really do not last very long in the soil. Some species, like blue oaks, basically, as soon as the acorn gets wet, it's going to start germinating. But most of the acorns really are not going to be viable for more than a couple of years in the soil. So even if you do have some acorns left from the last season, they are still going to need to quickly establish a new root system to compete with all the other plants that are also going to be germinating from the seed bank to try to take advantage of that newly clear post-fire habitat. However, though, oaks have another strategy, which is sprouting from trunk or root tissue. And so if the fire damage to the trunk is not really severe, let's say it does get up into the canopy, burns the leaves away and some of the branches, but the trunk is otherwise intact, many oaks are going to be able to resprout from underneath the bark and produce a new set of branches and leaves. If the fire is more severe and completely burns out the above ground portion of the tree, if the root system is sufficiently undamaged, you can actually get resprouting from the root crown. This is a real advantage for this new sprout that's coming up here. And so it might be a tiny little sprout that's just a foot tall, but it's attached to the large mature root system of its parent plant. So that's going to give it a huge leg up in terms of competing for water and other resources with other plants that are coming up after the fire. And so all California oaks are able to sprout from the root crown when they're young. This ability seems to get reduced in mature blue and valley oaks. But coast and interior live oaks remain excellent sprouters throughout their lifetimes. And so if you go hiking in the Bay Area, I really like hiking in Mount Tamalpais State Park. You'll see lots of trees that look like this. So this is a coast live oak that kind of looks like, you've got 5 or 6 different trees that all, germinated right next to each other. What this actually is resprout from a root crown. And so there was likely one single trunk here originally that then got killed off, potentially by a fire, maybe by something else. And then these new trunks all came out of that same root crown. And so that's a pretty nice adaptation. Sprouting can sometimes lead to large clones of interconnected oaks. This is especially true in some of the shrub oak species. So down in Southern California, there's a shrub oak called Palmer's oak. And Dr. Geoff Benn, who has a lab at UC Davis, his group found a Palmer's oak clone that had over 70 stems that were all connected together underground. And based on growth rate and rings in the root, they estimated that that clone likely started growing 13,000 years ago, which is pretty incredible. Okay, so that is fire. On to sudden oak death. And so, oaks are not only under attack from abiotic stresses like drought and fire, there's also lots of hungry organisms in the environment that would very much like to eat parts of the oak. So these include things like fungi and insects. But oaks have evolved a number of different defenses against these sorts of attacks. First are tannins, which are complex molecules that are found in a lot of different plants. So if you like red wines, there's often tannins in those red wines. Oaks have tannins in almost all of their tissues. And so bark, wood, acorns, and leaves. And these tannins in the oaks can interfere with normal protein function, for example, digestive enzymes. So that means that things that eat them are not going to get much or any nutrition from that because the tannins are interfering with the digestive processes. This is why if you want to eat acorns, you have to process them first. You have to grind them up and then leach all of those tannins out. They also have a bitter taste, which can help deter herbivores. They have a second line of defense, which are tyloses. And so if an oak tree is damaged or wounded, so let's say there's a windstorm and a branch snaps off, that means there's now an opening into the interior of the tree through the bark, which can be an access point for insects and especially fungi, who would then want to use the vascular system that's in the middle of the tree to spread systemically throughout the rest of the tree. So tyloses are basically plugs in the vascular system that block off the vascular tissue around that wound site and prevent spread of any pathogens from that wound. Okay, so on to sudden oak death. So sudden oak death has killed at least 5 million trees in California since the late 1990s. It's caused by this pathogen here. It is an oomycete. which is, kind of a fun name for a pretty scary organism. This one is called Phytophthora ramorum. It's a close relative of the organism that caused the Irish potato famine, Phytophthora infestans. This is able to infect a really, really wide range of species in California. So hundreds of different species can be infected by this pathogen, but most have really minor leaf symptoms. So it's not really going to hurt the plant, certainly not going to kill it. But for whatever reason, it is lethal to a few species, especially the tan oak and the coast live oak. And so those two species are most of the fatalities that have occurred in this outbreak. And so trees that get sudden oak death develop weeping cankers on their stems. And so you'll see, looks like kind of a reddish black ooze coming out of wounds on the bark. And by that point, the tree is almost certainly going to die. And death is thought to be caused by damage and blockages in the vascular system. And so sudden oak death, pathogen has been found in all of the coastal counties of California, from Monterey all the way up to the border with Oregon, and it has crossed the border into southwestern Oregon. It's found in some of the counties that border the coastal counties as well. And so it reproduces on the leaves of California bay laurel, produces sporangia, which then either get blown off or usually splashed off into waterways or into the soil, where they can then be transported onto a new host. And so efforts are concentrated on tracking the pathogen. So labs at UC Berkeley and UC Davis monitor streams throughout this whole region for those sporangia to see where the pathogen is and if it's spreading or not. But it is very important, that we do our part and make sure we're not inadvertently tracking spores into new areas. And so if you're going hiking or mountain biking or off-roading in areas that do have outbreaks, it's a good idea to wash off your shoes or tires before you head into areas that don't currently have the pathogen. And so, it's not all doom and gloom. So, this pathogen really does require a fairly wet environment to reproduce and spread. So it doesn't really show signs of moving much further inland, which is good for those of us that are here in Sacramento or Woodland. The other bit of good news is that it appears to only affect red oaks and golden cup oaks, but does not affect the white oaks. We're not totally sure why that is, but it may be due to differences in tannin biochemistry or in tylose formation. All right. So those are some of the stresses that oaks face and how they deal with them. We'll wrap things up here with a look at what the future holds for California oaks. So there are definitely some challenges. So one of them for particularly blue oaks and valley oaks is low regeneration rates. And so, if you go out hiking in places like the Cache Creek Wilderness, you'll see some young seedlings, quite a few mature trees, but very, very few kind of intermediate sapling-sized trees. And so that raises some concerns for what happens when all of our older mature trees eventually die off of age or fire. And so this may be due to some of the prolonged droughts we've had recently, competition from fast-growing non-native grasses, or grazing pressure. Habitat destruction is also a concern, especially for valley oaks. Valley oaks used to be really numerous all over the Central Valley, but about 90% of that habitat has been lost to development, both for housing and agriculture. So this is why it's really important that we protect areas that still do have good valley oak habitat. And so, for example, the River Preserve south of Sacramento is a really great example of classic valley oak habitat. And then along the drainages in places like the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, we still do have some really spectacular, large, old growth valley oaks. And so it's really important that we protect those places. Okay, so when we're thinking about the environment, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is, of course, climate change. And so, climate change could actually be a bit of good news for our California oaks. That's because they've spent, the last several million years becoming pretty well adapted for dealing with things like drought, heat, and wildfire. And so the study here that was done a few years ago has found that oaks have actually been expanding their range in a number of parts of the state and are projected to expand their range further, especially in places like the Sierra Nevada. So as it gets hotter, as fires become more prevalent, those conifers in the Sierra that really can't deal with those things as well are going to be pushed further up in elevation, and the oaks are going to likely take their place. And so likely we'll see more oaks in California in the future. All right, so to wrap things up, I told you a little bit about California oak diversity, and that our diversity here is due in large part to independent evolution of similar stress response strategies in each of the three major groups of oaks, the white oaks, red oaks, and golden cup oaks. I've told you that California oaks are definitely well adapted to drought and fire stress, though they may be vulnerable to habitat destruction and introduced pathogens such as sudden oak death. If you'd like to learn more about oaks, definitely recommend this book by Pavlik et al., Oaks of California. CalFlora is a really great resource for learning about California plants in general. Those range maps I showed, I got those from here. And then with that, I will say thank you, and I will open the floor up to questions. So if you have questions, you can either raise your hand and ask verbally, or you can ask the question in the chat.